Today we're going to begin a new series on the book of Revelation. And as we start this new study, let me say this. It is the Revelation, the book of Revelation. So we don't say Revelations. We're doing a study on Revelations. It is the revelation, the unveiling of Jesus Christ. And as always, this will be an introduction. And as you see, this is part one in our introduction. I'm not sure if there's going to be 2 parts or 4 parts at this point. I'm wrestling with how deep do we go in the introduction. Over the last many months, I've been reading copious amounts of literature on this important work, the book of Revelation. And we've spent a few years building up to this point, and I've shared a lot of things in preparation for us engaging in this series. And most recently, we did several on the Day of the Lord topic or theme, how it's a trans-historical motif. We went through John's Gospel, because John's Gospel is important to understand as a setup for the book of Revelation. We'll talk about that today and in the coming weeks. Also, the sermons that I shared on motifs and connecting concepts, those are very, very helpful because we're dealing with such a genre of symbolism, and it is necessary to be able to identify and track motifs and themes and things of that nature throughout the biblical text. And so today we're going to start the introduction, and one of the most underlooked, and really it's not discussed much, one of the things that's important if we're going to understand the book of Revelation is understanding Johannine literature. When I say Johannine literature, I'm talking about these works: the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then Revelation. And it's important to see these as coming from a single author, and that author being the Apostle John, the beloved, who was an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. And it's very helpful when we read these writings that we see the purposeful and the attentive way that he writes and he crafts his literary masterpieces. I love John as an author in the New Testament. We need to recognize his theology and how his theology flows through dualism. When I say dualism, I'm talking about parallelism or comparison by antithesis. John is one who draws a line in the sand, and he says there's only 2 sides. There's light and there's darkness. There's good and there's evil. There are the sons of God and the sons of the devil. On and on and on, as we learned in the Gospel of John and in the epistles of John, each of which we have done an exhaustive verse-by-verse study on during our time here in the church. We need to also see that he likes to write with irony, parody. And we need to recognize his style and his strategy in his literary creativity. It's very ingenious. It's very, very creative. And it's very thematic. With all of that said, there is a rebuttal to this importance in modern scholarship, which says there is no way that the Gospel of John, the epistles of John, and Revelation were written by the same author because the style is too different. First of all, let's examine the content conceptually. Maybe there is vocabulary differences, but maybe that can be explained. Because for example, when we look at Paul's letters, his vocabulary is different depending on when he was writing, and who he was writing to and the subject matter that was being discussed in his letter. So saying because vocabulary differs from these three, that means it can't be the same author, then you would have to eliminate Paul as being the author of the various letters that he himself has said he wrote. So you can't really use that, because beyond that, the differences can be explained when you understand that the biblical authors of the New Testament were using amanuenses much of the time. They transposed these letters or the Revelation or the Gospel to people other than themselves, oftentimes, that wrote for them as they spoke to them. And so a lot of times these vocabulary choices, which word would be used here or there, was contingent upon who they were speaking to and who was writing for them. Another better explanation for the differences in these three is the genre of these three. Genre matters when it comes to literary pieces. How many of you know that? Genre matters. Let me explain. The Gospel of John is a biography or a historiography of an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus Christ. That biography or historiography is going to be written different from, say, the epistles of John, what is called the epistles of John, because they are church letters that are written to a specific network of churches in and around Ephesus, a specific culture, an interworking relationship, working through problems that are happening and the church is facing at the time, which can vary. And so there's easy to see why there would be differences in a biography and a personal letter that's working through existing issues or potential issues. Can y'all see that? That's pretty easy to recognize, but somehow modern scholars have made, I think, too much of the differences in the style and the vocabulary, especially when you consider Revelation. And we're going to talk more about this next week. But Revelation is very unique. It is a standalone as far as it is a letter, in that it says it was written by John specifically to 7 churches in what is modern-day Turkey. 7 real churches that John had a working, established relationship with as an apostle, and he is addressing them specifically with a message from Jesus concerning issues and praises where they are to be commended. So it's a letter in that regard, but it's also said to be what? A prophecy. Now, when we hear the word prophecy growing up in the 21st century, we think of prophecy as foretelling the future, but that's not what that word means at its core and at its root. It can include, foretelling the future, but prophecy is a word from the Lord that is spoken to bring about the desired goal that God desires, whether that be repentance or changing this or changing that. It's responding to a message or a word from God, and usually it has to do with repentance. When you look at all the prophetic writings, what are called the prophets, the major and the minor prophets in the Old Testament, the message that they shared from God was repent. 99% of the time, repent. You're doing these things, you're engaging in idolatry, you're compromising in this way or that way, and it's calling them back to God and a single-mindedness to God. And so it does function in that regard for these 7 churches. as it works through these issues and then goes into the visions, which brings us to the third genre that the Revelation is. It is apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature was known to the Jews in the first century. It was something that was a part of their literary library available to them. And apocalyptic literature is very unique in that it's usually some type of otherworldly experience, visionary experience. You could even say out-of-body experience, so to speak, where someone is interacting with an otherworldly being. It's some divine being, an angel or God himself, etc. And what usually happens is they are given a heavenly perspective of things going on and concerning the earth. And usually apocalyptic literature is geared towards those who are dealing with or in the middle of injustice. And it's God's way of showing them that He still is in control of the universe and that He still is all-powerful. And even though there is suffering, it can be explained, but in order to be explained, you have to see it from another perspective, and that is from the perspective of God. And we're going to see a lot of that in the book of Revelation. And so, considering these genre differences, it explains the difference in vocabulary and sometimes even style. But when you look at the core theology, when you look at the dualism that exists in all three, when you look at the recurring themes, words, and concepts across all three, even though they're different genres, it is obvious to me to see that it comes from the same person and the same voice who is sent by God. Now, other keys to interpreting the book of Revelation is to recognize dominant themes, motifs, patterns, symbols, and recurring words or concepts. Because we're going in different genres, sometimes you don't have the recurring words, but you have recurring concepts. For example, Revelation uses symbolism to portray truths. And so you're not going to have recurring words when you're using symbolic symbols. And so you look for these patterns. You look for themes, motifs, patterns, symbols, recurring words or concepts. And you start with looking within Johannine writing. You get familiar enough with the gospel, the epistles, the Revelation. You've read it like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And this is meditative literature. You don't just read it, check the box, all right, I read my chapter a day, star for me. No, you read it and you meditate on it. You sit and dwell on it. And you do this over a period of time, and you're vested in it. You want to know, you want to understand. You're sincere in it for the right reasons, because you know it can instruct you in ways that God wants you to be instructed. And so you start thinking and recognizing these within Johannine writing, but even more than that, concerning the Revelation, the Bible at large. And I say that because the book of Revelation draws from allusions to the Old Testament more than twice of any other New Testament book. More than double. The second most allusions in any New Testament book is the book of Acts. And it's less than half of the allusions to the Old Testament found in the book of Revelation. Matter of fact, there are 590 known or certain allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. I don't know if you've ever counted the verses in the book of Revelation. That's a lot of allusions per verse in the book of Revelation. So it's drawing from a rich Old Testament background. So it's probably safe to say that the more familiar you are with the Old Testament and the context of the Old Testament, other writings that accompany the Old Testament, the better position you'll be to understand the Revelation, because it's drawing from this rich history and it has so many allusions to the Old Testament. Now, some of you may be asking, what do these words even mean? What if I'm going to recognize a dominant theme, I need to understand what a theme is. Well, a theme is a central or underlying topic, subject, or message within a story or writing that reveals the deeper meaning or purpose of the story or writing. And this is Revelation right here. Except it's more challenging for us because it's expressed in symbolism, and you have to unpack the meaning of the symbols. Okay, so that's a theme. What is a motif? It is a recurring idea or concept throughout a text, a repeated pattern. Are there repeated patterns in the book of Revelation or in Johannine literature? You're going to find out real soon. Yes, there is. A repeated pattern, an image, sound, word, or symbol that comes back again and again within a particular story. And this is what I love about Johannine literature. It is so recapitulatory. He says the same thing, but a different way. He tells us the same cycle using 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 vials. They all end at the same climactic event. It's not this linear, chronological playing out in the book of Revelation. If that's been your approach to Revelation, get amnesia in regard to that. Okay? The book of Revelation is not some chronological order timeline that's leading up to the end of days when Jesus comes. It's not that at all. Now, it does end or climax with a vision of the second coming and the final judgment and the new heavens. But it is not a build up to that in some chronological order, linear fashion that is confined to 7 or 3.5 years. You're totally missing it if that's been your approach. And that's been the approach for much of Western Christianity. And we'll explain more about that here in just a moment. So, what is a pattern? A pattern is a specific way of organizing ideas to convey a certain type of argument. We're going to see there are several patterns that are noteworthy in the book of Revelation. What is a symbol? We need to know this because Revelation is full of symbols. It is an abstract idea conveyed through an object that represents something that, some people need to underline this, that it is not in a literal sense. Something that it is not in a literal sense. So again, these are keys to a proper interpretation, is to recognize these. Now let me hit a few highlights in regards to words. And I'm going to start with words that either occur a lot or they're unique to. And I'm going to start with words that occur a lot or are unique to John and the rest of Johannine writing. The Gospel, the Epistles, and Revelation. And then I'm going to highlight some in Revelation, and I'm going to leave you some homework, and that is making you mindful when you read and trying to ask the right questions about these words. So, going back to our series in John, we see that life is a word that occurred pretty often in John, and you can see by the graph, this is every New Testament book. And when you look across that from Matthew to Revelation, you'll see that in John's Gospel, life is a major theme. It's a word that occurs often in John's Gospel. But you'll see it also occurs in 1 John and Revelation. often. Okay, so that's life that occurs often in all three. And it's pretty unique to those three, wouldn't you say? You could throw Romans in there, but other than that, those three use this word more than any other New Testament writings. Another one is keep. Now, it doesn't have the volume of occurrences, but it's pretty unique to John. You can see it's unique to Acts as well, Romans, but 1 John and Revelation. Keep, to keep or guard. Usually this word is accompanied by like keeping His commandments. And so it's in all three. Another one that was unique to John's gospel was the word true. Again, it's not a high volume of occurrences, not quite 20 occurrences in John's gospel, but as you see on the chart, it's very unique to John. But it's not just unique to John, it's unique to who else? John again, in 1 John and in Revelation. So when they say, there's too many differences for it to be the same author, hard, concrete, textual evidence to the contrary. Even though they're different genres, there still are recurring words in all three that are unique to those three. Okay? You can't dismiss hard evidence like this. Another word is honor or glory. You can see that it was a major theme or word used in John's gospel. You can see it's used in plenty of other places too. But it's not in the Johannine epistles, but look in Revelation. It's second only to John's gospel. So again, you have honor and glory being a word. Now there are other words. I'm just picking random ones to just show you points. You can do this same research and see more than what I'm showing you. Okay, I'm never going to be like show you everything because I'm not sure you would want to be here that long each Sunday. Now, I want to transition to the book of Revelation, and I want to show you the top 9 occurring nouns in the book of Revelation. And I want to challenge you to think about these words I'm going to show you and what conclusions should this move us towards when we have these particular words that are occurring. Let me show you the top 9 nouns in order from most to lesser as we go along. The number one occurring word in noun in the book of Revelation. Anyone want to guess what it is? It's a 3-letter word. He's kind of important to the Bible. He's a major theme. God. And this one's not so unique to Johannine literature, and that's kind of the point of me showing you this, at least with this one. He's kind of a big deal. God's kind of a big deal in the whole Bible. And He's not unique to one author or the other. He's unique to them all. As you can see, there's a large occurrence in all of the New Testament writings. But you can see in Revelation, it's used nearly 100 times. God appears in the Revelation. Number 2, and this is interesting data, is earth or land. You see how it's used 80 plus times in Revelation? Earth or land. What else is it unique to? The Gospels and Acts. So we start questioning in our minds, what is there relationally between the Revelation and the Gospel writers and Acts? Y'all ready for the answer? It's homework. It's homework. But let's ask another question. Why does earth and land appear so much? Anyone? Hold that thought. We'll return to it here in just a moment. The next occurring word, number 3, is angel. It's pretty unique to Revelation and what else? The Gospels and Acts and Hebrews. That's this right here speaks of the genre of it, because apocalyptic literature is dealing with otherworldly beings and, a message coming forth from those beings. So here we have angel occurring third most in Revelation. Another word. I don't know if you're seeing a pattern here. Voice or sound. This is number 4. Look at it in Revelation. But where else is it? The Gospels and Acts. We kind of have something going on here with Revelation and the Gospels and Acts, don't we? I'm going to let y'all chew on that. And as you study the Revelation and as we go through it, see if you can figure out why. The next one, 5th most, is heaven or sky. Man, look at that. Revelation is a lot, but what else is a lot? Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel is extremely Jewish in its origin and its nature. You have the other gospels as well that capture this, but Matthew really does a lot, and Revelation does. What's the connection? I don't know if you noticed thus far in this list in Revelation, we have heaven and sky, earth and land. Remember what I said? He's a master of dualism. Heaven or the skies, earth and land. Above and below. You seeing it? Another word, and this word is extremely unique to Revelation, and that is throne. Throne occurs over 45 times. You can see it's almost non-existent elsewhere. Why would this word throne be the 6th most occurring noun in the book of Revelation? Here's one of those beautiful things that you can understand, having read it and then just thinking about it. It's because after the addresses in chapter 2 and 3 to the 7 churches, the scene immediately shifts to the throne room of God, and the focus is on who really sits on the throne and who really rules the universe. This is charged and polemical against the claims of Rome and the emperor. And so it's giving us a heavenly perspective of who really sits on the throne and who rules the universe and who is the God of the universe. Heaven is the center of the universe. God's throne is in heaven, and He rules the universe. And chapter 4, which is where you see the throne start appearing a lot, is filled with beings falling in prostration unto Him and worshiping Him. What for? Because the first century Christians in Asia Minor were being coerced and even forced to worship the emperor and recognize him as divine, as the Son of God, and as God. And this is a rebuttal against that, showing us who the only one is who is worthy of worship, and that is the Creator. because He has created all things, and for His pleasure they are and were created. So that's a big part of why you have the throne being so prevalent in Revelation. It's polemical against the claims of Rome and the emperor. Now, here's where we're going to get into some words that are extremely unique to Revelation. This is the number 7 occurring word as far as nouns. It's beast or animal. Can you see that? You have a occurrence in Mark, a few in Acts, a few in Titus, Hebrews, and James, and then almost 40 occurrences of the word in Revelation. Why is that? Beast or animal is not literal, it's a symbol. And so our question should be, what does it represent? Is there some dominant word, say in John's gospel or in his epistles, that maybe he symbolizes with this word in the Revelation? Hold that thought. The number 8 occurring word is name. We return to what we saw early on, where it occurs in Revelation, but where else does it occur? In the Gospels and in the book of Acts. Name. Why is name a big deal in Revelation and in the Gospels and Acts? We've talked about what's associated with the name, character, teaching, etc. And so there's going to be the usage of names that we'll see in the Revelation. And number 9 on the noun list, and it's safe to say that it's unique to John, is lamb. Lamb. Notice that the only other place it occurs in the entire New Testament is where? John's Gospel. And I happen to know from memory where that is. It's in the story in John chapter 1 where John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God, which takes away the sins of the world." And then in Revelation, the Lamb appears often. You know what's interesting? In relation to the noun occurrences, it is the unveiling of Jesus Christ, and Jesus isn't on the list. His name, the literal name, Jesus, is not on the list. So I wonder if he's in the Revelation, but he's called something else. We will find out shortly. Now, here's something that is very unique to Revelation as well. This is the number 7. The number 7. You can see that it's also used in the Gospels and Acts. We got something going on with the Gospels and Acts and Revelation, don't we? But look at it in the Revelation. Like 55 occurrences in the Revelation. Why is that? Do you think maybe the number 7 represents something or symbolizes something? It does, and we'll find out in short order what that is. Here's another word that appears a lot. Great or loud. I don't know if you can see the numbers here, but this is over 80 occurrences. And again, the other main occurrences are in the Gospels and Acts. So you have great or loud. Usually that goes with a voice or a sound as an adjective. Now here's something that's very surprising. If you recall our study in the Gospel of John, you learned that this word thematically dominated the Gospel of John and 1 John, the word world. You guys remember that? Almost 80 occurrences in the Gospel. You have many occurrences you have some in 1 Corinthians, but in 1 John as well. So world was a major theme in the Gospel and in 1 John the Epistle. So why is it pretty much non-existent in Revelation? Or I wonder if he uses another word or symbol to express what he meant in the Gospel in 1 John by world. You remember that word that occurred, let's see, I think second or third most noun, second most, earth or land. And you remember that symbol that's like extremely unique to the Revelation? The beast. And it makes sense, earth or land, because earth or land was juxtaposed to what? Heaven or the skies. And so the world, instead of using that term, because he's juxtaposing it to this, this heavenly experience, this vision, where he's taken to heaven and given these visionary experiences and seeing God's perspective versus the world's perspective, he uses earth and land because it captures the juxtaposition better than if he used the word world. Okay? So that's the difference. And then obviously he uses the symbol of the beast or the animal. So again, these are keys to interpretation. You start recognizing these things, these patterns, these recurring words, these themes, motifs, etc. And you pay attention. Again, in looking at all of that data, and we're not even into the text. We're not even working through the text yet. We're just looking at this data. And again, I'm going to leave here thinking, man, why is there such a connection to the Revelation and the Gospels and Acts? Why is that? I want to know that. I see this pattern and I'm intrigued by it. And I won't stop looking until I feel like I have found a satisfactory answer. And I encourage you to think about that too. And if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to share. Okay, so these are keys to interpretation. Now, when it comes to Revelation, man, I really wrestled with how much to share and all of that, how far to go, press it, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to Revelation, there are four main interpretive methods. There is the futurist approach, which most people in the evangelical world in the West are familiar with, the futurist approach. There's the preterist approach. There is the historicist approach. And then there is the idealist approach. You're probably looking at that and you're thinking, I don't know what any of those mean necessarily other than maybe futurist. Let's briefly go through these. And we're going to go through these briefly, but I would encourage you in your own study time to go through them exhaustively. Because in my studies, I've always wanted to know why there are so many different beliefs on any given topic or subject. And what I do is I go and I read from that perspective. I read something from that perspective, see how they utilize the Scriptures to come to these conclusions, to see how they're thinking. For example, Calvinism. I think it's a heretical soteriology, but years ago, I was like, I want to understand why a Calvinist thinks the way that they do and how they use the text. And so what I did is I went and I studied a lot of literature written by Calvinists to get into their head and to understand, why do they see it this way? Why do they interpret it this way? And the same I have done for all the eschatological camps, the futurists, the preterists, the historists, and the idealists. All these camps can be broken down into many levels, and I'm not going to get that deep into it, but I encourage you to look into it, because we need to see where they're coming from, and we need to hear them out and weigh it against the text. Who's right? And I can say this: all of these camps have elements of truth in them, but they create camps and go beyond the truth in each of these, I feel. And so I want to kind of highlight these 4 interpretive methods, these approaches, and I want to explain maybe some of the pros and some of the cons of each of these camps and things that we can be looking at whenever we get into the text. So first off is the one most of us are probably familiar with. That is the futurist approach. The futurist approach treats the book of Revelation as containing primarily unfulfilled prophecy that will in large part or entirely be fulfilled in the future. When I say in the future, at the end of days, which ironically, people who are in this camp, it's always their day. They're always living in the last of the last days. And so the book of Revelation is all about events happening in their lifetime. That's a poor way of approaching Revelation. There are some things that are future. The second coming is future. The final judgment is future. But the whole book of Revelation was written to 7 churches in the first century. First and foremost, it has to be relevant to them. And it has to be discernible to them. And oftentimes in our church world, the book of Revelation is cast in this book that needs to be decoded, and it can only be decoded by those who are living in the last of the last days. And again, it's always the people who are claiming that. We're living in the last of the last days, and we're the only ones that could decode it. That's retarded. It has to be discernible and understandable and applicable to the audience it was written to. Because let me say this, I'll say it many more times, the book of Revelation wasn't written to you or me. It was not written to the well. It was written to 7 churches in Asia 2,000 years ago in a specific time, place, location, historical setting under the rule of the Roman Empire during a time where the emperor was demanding to be worshipped or else. And we have to filter it through that reality or we're going to make a mess of it. Okay? The futuristic approach is usually a very literal method of interpretation that's based on, here's the book of Revelation, it's in chronological order, but these events aren't going to start happening in chapter 4 until the final 7 years. Then the clock's ticking, and then all of these events are going to happen in linear concession, and they're going to happen literally. Like locusts, giant locusts are going to be on the earth. Some will get creative and say, no, they're not giant locusts, they're helicopters. John was just, he was talking about helicopters, and he was like way ahead of his time, and he just didn't know what to use as helicopters, so he called them locusts. That's creative, but it's also dumb because it's not relevant to the audience it was written to. Okay? So there are a lot of problems with the futurist approach. Now, the futurist approach tries to harmonize Revelation with Daniel, in particular, the 70 weeks of Daniel, in prophecies in Ezekiel, and with the Olivet Discourse. The problem is they see all of it as future. They see the entire Olivet Discourse, which for the most part is about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and they see that as a Jerusalem at the end of days, and it's all about the second coming. No. Now, we covered this in the Day of the Lord studies that I taught on, where the Day of the Lord is a trans-historical motif, is a recurring event, and how that the Olivet Discourse was showing us that the destruction of the temple is a day of the Lord, which is a microcosm of the macrocosm, which is the day of the Lord when Christ does return and ushers in the eternal kingdom. So they, in their attempt to harmonize Daniel, Ezekiel, and the Olivet Discourse, they do it in an overly literal method, and they ignore the audience that it was said to, written to, and concerning. And they see it all as future. In recent times, in the last 200 years, most in this camp, or many in this camp, see this being limited to a 7-year period, or some to a 3.5-year period. And then all of these events are happening in chronological order. Literally. You can scratch that off the list. I can assure you that is not the correct approach. Now, we can't say that it's totally bunk, though, because the second coming of Jesus and the final judgment is a future event. That hasn't happened. The resurrection of all righteous or unrighteous has not occurred. So there is a futuristic aspect of Revelation, but not everything in it, or what they try to harmonize it with in the Olivet Discourse or Daniel or Ezekiel, is. And we need to understand that. They are very literal in believing in a literal Antichrist, in a literal mark of the beast that's going to be imposed, only for 3.5 years. The church is going to be gone, of course. They're not going to have to go any through. They're going to be gone, which is made up. I mean, you can't even find anything to support that the church is going to be gone. But it's usually a literal Antichrist, a literal mark of the beast, and a literal 144,000 virgin Jews that are going to be evangelizing the world in the last 7 or 3.5 years. 2 literal witnesses that are going to be killed. No. That is not good at all. At all. And we're going to explain why. Now, this became popular because of John Darby. He adopted this dispensationalist attitude, this futuristic approach, and it was put in the Scofield Reference Bible, which was published. A bunch of people in the West ended up with that Bible. They didn't read the Bible for themselves. They read the notes, and so they believed nonsense. And here we are with the Western Church believing a lot of nonsense because they adopt to and sell out to this futuristic approach, which everything's in the future, the last of days. But don't worry, we're going to be raptured out of here. So, why would we care about it then? If all of this in Revelation is going to happen in the 7-year period that we're not even going to be around, let's just go home. Why study the book of Revelation? Anyway, the only pro to this view, is that it recognizes the second coming as a literal event, and it is. That it recognizes the resurrection as a literal event, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul is on the record saying it is not some spiritual event, and it's heresy to say that it is. It is a literal event, just like it was for Jesus. And it is premillennial. Now, don't confuse historical premillennialism with dispensational premillennialism. Dispensational premillennialism is which believes in this linear chronology, literal mark of the beast, literal 7 years, literal 3.5 years, literal Israel restored at the end of days, blah, blah, blah. No. But it does believe that Jesus comes, ushers in the millennial kingdom. Now, how you view that millennial kingdom, how you interpret that is another story and a big can of worms that we're going to open in due time. And so we'll return to and talk about that when we get to chapter 20 in Revelation. But that's the only pros to this view. It recognizes the second coming as a literal event, a literal resurrection, and it's premillennial in nature. Now, that's the futurist approach. Everything's in the future. And then we flip the coin and you have a camp, the preterist. And they're the opposite. Everything has been fulfilled by 70 AD. They treat the book of Revelation as containing prophecy that has been in large part or entirely fulfilled by 70 AD. I say in large part or entirely because there's partial preterism and there's full preterism. But preterism believes, other than partial preterism, that all of it is prophecy that was literally fulfilled by 70 AD. Climactically with 70 AD. They view 70 AD as when Jesus came, and because of that, they have to view the resurrection as being a spiritual or non-literal event. That's the biggest problem with this view, is they have to spiritualize the resurrection, and Paul does not allow for that. Now, the pros of preterism is that they do recognize that the Olivet Discourse primarily was about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's no denying that. And so they're corrective to the futurist who believes that the Olivet Discourse is all about the second coming, and it's not. So that is a pro of preterism. Preterism relies on the Olivet Discourse, just as the futurist approach. It sees it differently. But another thing about preterism is its literal interpretation based on passages like, and I know you're familiar with them, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. Or there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. And so they take that literally, and they're like, it had to have happened in the lifespan of the apostles. And the event that they want to corroborate it all with is 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, because after all, Jesus is on record in the Olivet Discourse talking about in the same breath the destruction of the temple and the second coming. But it ignores the resurrection in the second coming, which is a literal event, and preterism is forced to spiritualize that event, and that's the biggest problem with preterism and putting it all as fulfilled prophecy by 70 AD. Now, I do know some preterists who will say the Matthew 27 event is the resurrection. And so they believe that's the first resurrection in Revelation 20, and we're awaiting the second resurrection. I disagree with that. I'll show you why when we get to that portion of Revelation, because of who all it says to include in the first resurrection and how an exhortation is given to those that it was written to, that blessed is and holy is he who takes part in the first resurrection. And if you believe Revelation was written after the destruction of the temple, well, that's kind of a problem. Which is another point of preterism. They are forced to believe or accept that Revelation was written before 70 AD. Otherwise, you can't make it work. But the problem is we have someone within 100 years of the Revelation on the record saying that Revelation was written near the end of Domitian's reign, which is dated to the end of the 1st century. So you got the weight of that to wrestle with. And then most who have studied the Revelation believe that it's dated to the late 90s AD and not before the destruction of the temple. Some of the other passages, the literal interpretation of passages are, these are the days of vengeance, Luke 21. You will not go through all the towns of Israel until the Son of Man come. So again, they focus on the imminence language. And to their credit, for example, the book of Daniel, Daniel's told, seal up the scroll till the time of the end. In Revelation, there's no sealing up. The time is at hand. The time is near. So you have the time is near, the time is at hand, the time is near. So the preterist says, well, it had to have happened then. And that's if they're taking it literal. Or you ask the question, what is near? All of it? Some of it? What? I mean, there's a lot of questions. So you can see why there's a lot of different viewpoints and camps on this. And I think we can make good sense of it as we go through the text, though. But to their credit, they do have some good points. They do have a literal view on the 3.5 years just prior to the destruction of the temple. They view that as happening in the late 60s AD. The 3.5 years of Revelation, they pinpoint it, to the years leading up to the destruction of the temple. But again, the biggest hole in preterism is they have to spiritualize the resurrection. And there are major problems with that, as we'll see. The next one is the historicist approach. This is popular among the reformers. I'll explain why here in just a moment. But it treats the book of Revelation as events playing out in history. This method tries to pinpoint certain figures and events with major historical events and figures from the Revelation. It applies them to, people and places and events in history, whether in the past, present, or future. Now, let me highlight the pro. Certain things in Revelation can be pinpointed to a time and place in history. Okay? Some, not all. And the reason why it was popular with the reformers is because they wanted to say the Pope was the Antichrist. So they had a literal interpretation of the Antichrist. He was the Pope. And if he's the Pope, then Catholicism is the beast in their model. Now, analogously, I agree that the Pope is a Antichrist and Catholicism is a beast. But so is Reformed theology. So it's the beast calling the beast a beast. We all beast in that scenario. And may I say this, that Reformed theology is a greater beast than Catholic theology. Yeah, I said it. Reformed theology is worse than Catholic theology. Because Reformed theology does away with works, and it's by works we will all be judged. So it's flawed soteriologically. That is the biggest problem we can have in any of the camps that exist, is a soteriological problem, because that is the doctrine of salvation. We can, guys, we can disagree eschatologically. None of us know exactly how things are going to unfold. Trying to figure that out is missing the point of the revelation. What we need to understand as we go through the revelation is how it should inform how we should live our lives, because there's going to be two sides at the end of the day, at the end of the game. And we want to make sure we're on the right side. And that's why soteriology is way more important than eschatology and is far less ambiguous, because God is not going to leave us on an ambiguous limb when it comes to our souls. But He is going to leave us on an ambiguous limb when it comes to the day that He will return. Jesus Himself is on record for saying, no man knows the day or the hour. Jesus said that. So Hal Lindsey ain't going to figure it out, and nobody else is. And what's crazy about those who have a historicist approach is they're always having to fine-tune and rearrange their nice little timeline when it doesn't play out the way they think it should or they thought it should, and the Pope died and Jesus didn't come and kill him. You know, Catholicism lives on. Well, you have to revise your model. And if you had a correct interpretation of the model, it doesn't need revising. So this is a bad approach in many ways, other than there are certain things that can be pinpointed. But to try to pinpoint it all and say, that's this earthquake in history, or this plague is this plague in history, you're playing a game God did not want to be played when He gave the revelation. Again, I think a lot of this was rooted in rebellion. Catholicism needed reformed, but the reformers were not in the place to reform what needed to be reformed by redefining the Bible in terms that misrepresent it. The historicist uses Daniel in the 70 weeks with Revelation, but again, they're trying to pinpoint everything in Daniel and Revelation to this event or that event, or this figure or that figure. And it creates this ever-changing pinpointing. And they never obviously get it right, or they wouldn't have to keep changing their model. So that's the historicist approach. The last one is the idealist approach. The idealist treats the book of Revelation as neither past or present events. It sees it as completely non-literal, symbolic account that captures the struggle between good and evil, highlighting the prevail of good. Now, let me start with the con of this. The con is that it treats the book of Revelation in its entirely as non-literal, with the exception of, some idealists will say, well, the second coming and the final judgment are not symbolic. They're literal events, but everything else is symbolic. Some of them will say all of it's symbolic. The pros of the idealist approach is that it allows for the transhistorical application of the revelation, and that is a pro of this approach. Another pro is it doesn't fancy itself with pinpointing this or that figure or event with this or that in history. And it's not making the book of Revelation exclusively about some generation living at the end of days, which is, of course, our generation. It doesn't do that. And it focuses on the best part of Revelation that needs to be absorbed, and that is highlighting the prevail of good in the end. Because for those first century Christians living in the Roman Empire, being a Christian did not seem like prevailing, at least as far as their lives here on earth. And that's why they needed John to have this visionary experience where he goes to heaven and gives them the world from God's perspective. That's what the revelation is. It is the world as God sees it from His perspective. Here's how it's going to end. Here's why it's important to be loyal and faithful to Him and not bow to the Caesar or to Rome or society. There is only one Lord and one Creator. There is only one who sits on the throne and one who is worthy to be worshipped, and it's no mortal. And so it does focus on the big picture of the revelation. And so I really like that about the idealist approach. And it also doesn't try to pinpoint these symbols literally, because these symbols aren't meant to be interpreted literally in large part. And another pro, it doesn't have this fancy linear timeline that we're checking the box when we get to the end of ages in 7 or 3.5 years. One of the cons, another con, is that it overlooks the historical 7 churches. This was a letter, a prophecy, apocalypse, written to 7 real churches. Now, with that said, the fact that John chose 12 churches adds the representative transhistorical reality to the address to the 7 churches. We'll talk about that when we get to that point. But it's not one or the other, it's both and. It is 7 real churches, but the fact that he chose 7, and 7 is a representative number, then these 7 churches also represent something beyond themselves. But it's still 7 churches, and he speaks specifically to problems that they are dealing with. So, that's a flaw with the idealist approach, at least in that area of Revelation. So, as far as an introduction, this has went fast, okay? I have a couple more weeks, but before we leave, I want to read 2 snippets from my clippings of one of my readings that are very helpful. I'll put these in our Facebook group this afternoon, all of the clipping. I resourced the book in our group the other day. If you get that book, skip down to, I think, chapter 24 and read all that he says about Revelation. It's probably one of the best written introductory pieces that I've read on the Revelation as far as seeing and understanding the big picture. So let me read you a few snippets, and I encourage you to buy that. If nothing else, at least read the clippings that I include for you guys to read. Okay? He says this: many popular interpreters of Revelation try to make sense of its visions by looking to the future, decoding its images in terms of contemporary politics and forecasting how our history will unfold. In so doing, they ignore the basic principle of exegesis, that a text is written to make sense to its original audience. John's wild and fantastic images invite Christians living in the Roman province of Asia Minor during the last decade of the 1st century to perceive the true character of the realities that face them every day, and to respond to them in a way that will allow them to share in the triumph of the Lamb rather than in the punishment of Babylon. Revelation liberates 1st century Christians from the myth of the emperor and Rome, from the tainted prosperity that beguiled the peoples of the Mediterranean, from witnessing violence and calling it rule of law. It frees them to live out their lives in witness to the one true God and to the demands of God's justice and to God's beneficent vision for human community and wholeness, and thus in critique of the pretensions and injustice of the dominant culture and its order. The persistent challenge of Revelation is not to discern the fulfillment of its predictions in contemporary history or to map out the 7 last years, but to discern the true nature of the society around us in the light of God and the Lamb. Thus, more particularly in the light of the scriptural witness to God's vision for justice in human community, and in light of the inevitable day of their wrath. Understanding John's critique of the Roman Empire and of all quiet and profitable compromise with that system provides a paradigm for lifting the veil that every power system dones to hide its true nature and to win unquestioning support from the undiscerning. And then in the section that says Revelation and Ministry Formation, it says, Revelation still interprets and calls us to interpret the social, political, religious, and economic realities of our everyday experience. I would suggest that this is best done not on the principle of identity, not focused on identifying and pinpointing this is that and this is that, but on the principle of analogy, understanding the concepts, understanding what's being represented in the symbol, and then finding the analogy in our day. That's what he's saying here. We cannot justifiably attach labels from Revelation's visions to persons or institutions in our experience and claim that this is the definitive meaning of John's vision. We are only playing endless games when we say such and such an earthquake fulfills such and such a sign, or that so and so is the beast or the third horseman, or that this current enemy of our nation is Babylon the Great, and so forth. Too many voices already engage in endless attempts to play pin the tail on the Antichrist. Rather, as we probe Revelation to discover what John was after in his own setting, to determine his rationales for opposing this figure or that activity, we can then move to our setting and see where an analogous situation might exist to us. In such a way, Revelation would continue to help believers look beyond the interpretation of the status quo our dominant cultures impose on us, freeing us to see things in light of God and the demands of God's justice. Any questions? No questions? I bet y'all have questions in the weeks to come, because I have questions too. Would you stand?